Buenas tardes, espero que estén bien. Ya siendo las 2:05 creo que podemos dar comienzo a nuestro seminario. Y hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial. Eh, la charla va a ser en inglés, entonces me voy a pasar al inglés para introducir a nuestro invitado. Hi Deval, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have with us Dr. Deval Desai. He's lecturer in international economic law at the Edinburgh Law School. And he kindly accepted to join our seminar to talk about one of his recently published articles and also to relate it to a different, shorter article that he wrote with a colleague of his. So welcome, Deval. We're really glad to have you with us. Well, the title of the seminar today, I hope you like it, it's Academics, Advocates, and Policymakers, Time, Space, and Identity in Knowledge Production. That's the title we came up with. So what's the dynamic of the seminar? You will have around 20 minutes to discuss your papers with us, the main arguments, something you want to stress. And after that, we will open the discussion with all the students and members of faculty that are present. So without any further introduction, thank you again for being with us, Deval, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Manuel, Daniel, and all of you who are here to listen to me in my strange purple apartment talk to you a little bit about my work. It's such a pleasure to be back speaking with a group of people at Los Andes or linked to Los Andes. I was saying earlier how not just enjoyable, but also intellectually so exciting I found the times that I've come to Los Andes. And as much as it is a shame that it's not possible to go to Bogota at any point right now, I'm really grateful for this online platform that allows me to at least communicate with you sort of in person. So for that, I'm very, very grateful to both the organizers for the seminar. Really, I'm just going to talk pretty briefly, and I'd like to do so in the spirit of a conversation. I have no intention of talking authoritatively at you on any topic. I'm really interested in discussing back and forth with you some of the thoughts that come out of this strand of work, and also to hear the perspectives that can enlighten us and can enlighten me from yours. So with that in mind, I'm just going to do three things today, and I'm going to try and keep it pretty simple. The first is I'm going to tell a story. The second thing is, after that story, I'm going to summarize a little bit of the arguments from the paper that the sort of longer paper on indicators that you have seen, just sort of the bits that are relevant for some of the reflections that I'll have. And then the third bit are those reflections, which is really just to make 3 points about 3 points that I think arise from these papers. One is about the possibility of critical work on the Sustainable Development Goals and other global processes insofar as they have something to say about law. The second is to make a point about the complexities of engaging with such processes as political actors. And third, the effects of my argument on how we might think about our ethical and political positions as academics, activists, policymakers, whatever it might be. So, a story. Unfortunately, the story is about me. So for those of you who have read the paper, you know that I've already spent too long talking about myself. So this I'm going to keep as brief as possible. But it's really sort of a prologue, an introduction to the character that you see in the paper that speaks in my voice. So I'm somebody who, in this prologue, I'm somebody who works on rule of law reform, whatever the rule of law is, in fact, whatever reform is, who knows what that is. And I've done that in practical, scholarly, and advocacy guises or roles, although the distinction between them is a little bit hard to grasp for me. And I've done that across different scales, so from global institutions to local advocacy groups. And the story that I want to tell you is one of a relationship. And this is a story of 5 phases of my relationship with this field of rule of law reform. So phase 1, I went initially to work with organizations like the World Bank with a strong belief that I was smarter and savvier and way more critical than those guys inside these institutions. I believe that these institutions and the people inside them promoted these one-size-fits-all neoliberal legal models all around the world. And I thought, you know, me being so clever, I could link together some sort of scholarly critiques of these models with policy action. So, you know, I could be the guy who translated sort of big critical ideas into really changing the way that these people thought and maybe worked. Now, common to the sort of set of critiques that I was thinking with were, you know, the simple idea, transplantation has been insufficiently sensitive to local realities or to contexts. It is, in a strong guise, imperialistic. You know, I'm thinking with critiques of legal transplants, that sort of thing. And common to this, you know, little mental, I won't be so grand as to call it architecture, my small mental, you know, Lego blocks, was that I was drawing on very contextually oriented domains of knowledge. So particularly anthropology and history of the real world, and drawing on those to critique these processes of rule of law reform. So that's phase 1. Phase 2 of my relationship was very quick. I very quickly discovered, it followed on very quickly, I very quickly discovered that this idea that the real world and its context should be introduced to these idiotic technocrats was in no way the brilliantly novel idea that I thought it was. My colleagues got this point through and through, obviously. They knew this very well. And instead, our discussions turned pretty rapidly to finding some way of developing ideas about legal systems that might travel from context to context. So what might a good legal system look like that could travel from context A to context B, while at the same time being sufficiently adaptable to those contexts? So for example, how might one contextualize or adopt some general idea about a mining law to the context and the political economy of Sierra Leone? So methodologically, the additional Lego block here is legal design. So sort of moving from anthropology history to ideas, tools from legal design. Phase 3. Again, very soon after being in phase 2, I pretty quickly discovered that my colleagues at the World Bank, at the UN, were also very capable of critiquing that approach. They would ask very good questions like, well, who decides on the balance between the features of the model and its contextualization? How much should the model be contextualized? On what basis? What is the relationship between the knowledge of the context and decisions on what or how to adapt? Who produces the evidence? How much evidence should one use? And so on. So methodologically, here, third little building block, this is drawing on roughly the sociology of scientific knowledge in its vulgar and its more scholarly forms, surprisingly. The general question being, who has the authoritative knowledge to determine what are the universal dimensions of the rule of law and what are the particular dimensions of the rule of law? So that's phase 3. Phase 4. As soon as I have got my head around phase 3, and the fact that I'm having these discussions with my colleagues, I found that some subset of them were already one step ahead. If the phase 3 critique was, well, who should get to contextualize legal institutions and on what grounds? In phase 4, colleagues were implementing rule of law reforms which incorporated that critique into their processes. They were focused on developing reform processes that were experiments. They explicitly use the language of experimentation. For some, experimentation in the randomized control trial sense, it's a slightly different crowd. Here, this is the crowd that's talking about experimentation in both its philosophical and pragmatic senses. The general idea is to build institutions specific to the context, experiments, that would be the experiment, to solve some sort of problem, see what happens, try and learn applicable lessons for elsewhere, test these applicable lessons or apply those lessons to institutional experiments elsewhere, test that out again, keep learning, keep feeding back into the ongoing experimental process. Now, this took on an interesting and quite particular flavor when it came to rule of law reform. So rather than being institutional experiments about a specific problem like overfishing or overfarming, this was a set of experiments geared towards building a legal system or a rule of law system itself. And here things get a little bit weird. So do you try and define the rule of law? Do you try and define the goal towards which these experiments are moving? If you try and define it, you're back in phase 2, where you have to ask who defines, who decides. If you don't define it, if you don't define what the rule of law is, and you say, well, let's just try out different institutions. How do you know where to start? What is a rule of law experiment if you don't know what the rule of law is? Or better yet, what isn't a rule of law experiment? And so here I started to see claims from colleagues that pretty much everything was a rule of law experiment, even family planning interventions. So getting, family planning materials, condoms and stuff out to people became a rule of law experiment. Underlying that dynamic is the absence of a shared view of the rule of law or a clear basis to define it. So the point here is that when we're talking about family planning interventions, we're very, very far away from those people who we might imagine have stuck to a definition of the rule of law as contract enforcement, bankruptcy rules, formalized property rights, and so on. Instead, I was working with colleagues who left a definition of rule of law radically open-ended to be worked out over and over and over again in lots of different experiments. Now, this is interesting. You can really radically try and contextualize your institutional experiments, give it the air of some sort of broad legal project. And then you imagine that whatever the rule of law is, it'll get worked out in practice over time. So methodologically here, again, there's another shift. We're shifting a little bit towards the anthropology and sociology of development practice. We're shifting towards organizational sociology to try and structure how we think about how the rule of law might get worked out in iterated and reiterated practice. Everything is the contingent action of implementation. Now, phase 5, my 5th phase of my relationship with this rule of law field, is what you see in the paper that you looked at today and the subject of my book that'll be coming out hopefully next year, which is how do you situate some sort of really radically open-ended process like that within the broader context of development or global governance today? To put it another way, how do you find the edges of this really open-ended, really diffuse process that can be anything and everything in order to try and critique its political effects and its power effects? So that's kind of where this paper that you've read sort of begins, where it tries to start, trying to find those edges and how one strand of my work has sort of developed. So having sort of told that story, let me just turn to the paper that you've read and summarize some of the bits of the argument. So the context of the paper is that this is a year or two before the launching of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is taking place in, I think, 2013, 2014, something like that. And it's very much in the context of what was then discussions around whether and how the rule of law, justice, security should form part of the Sustainable Development Goals, which eventually became Sustainable Development Goal 16. And my co-author and myself, Marika and myself, had been part of indicator development processes from shortly before the workshop that you've read about all the way through to 2015, in fact. And so the workshop that you've read about was an experts workshop to come up with goals and indicators convened by some UN organization. And both myself and Marika, my co-author, thought that the very idea of indicators of the rule of law was a pretty silly idea. the rule of law, we were sure, was too complex to define, too often focused on these neoliberal ideas about what the rule of law is, and that we thought that the very idea of implementing the rule of law through indicators was way back in sort of phase 1 or phase 2, you know, this sort of economistic technology that was wrong for something as political as the rule of law. So we went sort of with a view that we would be the savvy people, again, phase 1, phase 2. We would participate, but also reflect, and we do that sort of phase 3 sociology of science thing. In practice, totally different experience. It did not work out like that at all. First, the discussion absolutely was not organized around either one universal idea of the rule of law that was sort of shared as a model in people's heads, or even competing ideas about the rule of law, you know, a human rights one versus the economist one. Not at all. It was organized in a very important way around the idea that whatever we might think the rule of law was, we fundamentally did not and could not actually know that. We might have one person might have some vague idea, but what we all sort of shared was a sense that it was pretty impossible to know what the rule of law was, that it was too complex, too political to know, and that the idea of developing indicators for the rule of law was in fact too reductive of its complexities. So everyone, it turned out, was able to at least articulate that thought quite frequently. And so second, it followed on that not only were they able to articulate that, the other participants, but that it was actually quite useful for them to keep invoking the impossibility of defining the rule of law. That would allow them to collapse someone else's idea for what a good target or indicator was, to keep the discussion open, to allow different visions of the rule of law to be proposed. It ranged from people in pretrial detention to the number of people killed on roads, to keep that open and allow them to be proposed, but to never get too concrete, for nothing to ever settle into some definition of the rule of law that could be adequately encoded into an indicator. Third, the impossibility of defining the rule of law also scrambled people's roles. So people were generally there in some sort of either an academic role, an advocate role, or a policymaker role in some sort of very general sociological sense. But facilitated by this recognition that it was impossible to define the rule of law, people who were there with an academic hat on could often make advocacy points and invoke moral outrage. Policymakers made big kind of structural critical points that you would imagine academics might make, and so on. Fourth, there was, quite importantly, another key group who were not present, although their name, their figure was repeatedly invoked by the participants. This were the people, the communities, generally the people who were going to be governed by these indicators, a general idea of people out there in the real world. And they were central to claims that the rule of law was simultaneously too complex to understand. So an invocation of their lived reality was really crucial to saying, well, who knows what the rule of law is anyway? But at the same time that the task was urgent. So invoking them was a way of demonstrating the urgency of the task in hand. Their lives and experiences mattered, their position should be understood. And that had a second function of imbuing the discussion with the legitimacy that seems to come from engaging with the people who are going to be subject to these indicators. And the fifth consequence that I just want to flag is that a consequence of this political dynamic was to make whatever we proposed, whatever goals and indicators, targets and indicators we proposed, completely provisional. So very quickly, the language emerged of piloting or prototyping indicators, making different baskets of indicators to be tailored. So some indicators put in, others taken out, individual indicators to be adjusted, depending on specific contexts. Crucially, we pretty much, or the tenor of the room was such that there was a general agreement that funding should certainly be provided to continually test, pilot, and experiment with different indicators, and continually adapt them to different contexts. And also, unsurprisingly, I guess, that we would be the people who are best suited to do that piloting, prototyping, and contingent implementation. Now, just as a quick aside, it is very much worth questioning the external validity of my account. I mean, so sure, I have this story from an indicator workshop, who cares? Is it actually relevant to anyone's ideas about the rule of law? So just a couple of thoughts on that quickly. One is there's interesting levels of evidentiary support emerging from a couple of different people's work, as well as some empirical pointers. So one is the outcomes of this process that I was describing. It's worth noting that even today, SDG 16 implementation is organized around piloting, baskets, provisional, contingent implementation, which is hugely different to the Millennium Development Goals. So the SDG 16 targets are extremely general, such as upholding the rule of law at the national and international levels. There are then lists of indicators. Those indicators are rooted in very contested and in implementation, actually in implementation as we see, highly redefinable and reiterable terms. So satisfaction with public services to continually be readjusted and redefined in different contexts. And even then, those lists of indicators that exist are completely non-exclusive and non-exhaustive of others. So implementation of SDG 16 remains very, very broad from context to context. And you can see this if you go to the SDG 16 hub. If you just throw that into Google, you'll see a very wide range of projects and indicators, some of which are focused on those listed on the indicators listed on the UN website, but others which are specifically about trying to tailor the general target or even the general goal to different contexts. So there's a real variability and reiteration of continuing implementation of SDG 16. And as mentioned, there's interesting secondary literature, which I'll just point to some names and we can go into resonances subsequently, but Fleur Johns' work is sort of pointing to similar dynamics that she sees in development policy processes more generally. There's work on ignorance and global governance that sits alongside my work. And there's also political relevance as well. And this is where I'll just pivot to the final 3 points that I want to make. There is political importance in considering the possibility that these sorts of claims to have no idea what the rule of law or security or institutional phenomena really mean, there's political importance to taking that seriously. And that is a concern that something like rule of law reform might provide a meaningful semblance of dealing with fundamentally contested first order political issues, while diverting attention from other really consequential processes, such as one group of policymakers at the World Bank say very expressly, interest rate setting. They claim that that is to be distinguished from governance and institutional issues, where interest rate setting is the domain of, quote, 10 smart people, and governance and institutions is the domain of fundamental political contestation. So there might be a division of political labor by keeping ideas about the rule of law quite empty and sucking in political energy. So just to summarize briefly, this is a paper that's thinking about efforts to implement indeterminacy about the rule of law and the effects of that. And I'm focusing in the paper on indicators because it's quite pronounced there, but it can be in projects or projects as well. And I'm trying to argue that rather than see that as a fool's errand or a fake practice, that we should perhaps think about how politically generative that process can be. In particular, this process is very effective at engaging with and internalizing critiques of rule of law reform and mobilizing them for the political processes of perpetuating rule of law reform. And there's a key contextual dimension to this, which is the SDG context that is really exacerbating, I think, this process. In particular, because the SDGs call for and are accompanied by a, quote, data revolution in aid. There's a massive contemporary intensification of data gathering, both quantitative and qualitative. So there's massive amounts of funding for ethnographic fieldwork, which I then touch on in the other piece, all the way through to the harvesting of big data. which we could understand in Foucauldian terms, the continual datafication of life. But I'm also just, I guess, quite in a very simple way, pointing out a point that many others have made, which is that data can also overwhelm, undermine, make fluid, and reduce knowledge in a way that can serve the purposes of global governance as well, perhaps by producing provisional forms of rule, such that ignorance and not just knowledge could also be power. So I'm not sure, I can stop there. I have a couple of other sort of concluding thoughts that I can make, but I'm also very happy to stop there. And then if and when they come up, I can come back to them as you wish.
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So then let me just give my 3 very quick points so that we can get quickly into the discussion. One is, so how do you critique this sort of process? So we might imagine in a very reductive way a couple of traditions of critical thought that we would ordinarily turn to critique things like indicator processes. Some of the people present here today have worked with these traditions in really powerful ways. One of them is what various scholars that you'll all know very well have called suspicious or paranoid or unmasking or backstage modes of critique, pointing to the sort of hidden truths that indicators mask. These truths might be structural, sociological, discursive, and so on. And so we might think of the Foucauldian work on indicators as technologies of global governance. So that might be one strand of critique. There's another strand of critique which might be a little bit more pragmatic, which often looks a fair bit like the sort of work that you see in the paper on indicators here today, which is stepping into the middle of action. So focusing on the messiness of action and pointing out the contingencies of the process through which the authoritative artifact of this indicator was made. And the focus there is on pointing to the contingency of that process. And so here the critical work isn't on the outside looking in, but is observing the intimate process of indicator construction and taking quite seriously the different knowledges distributed across all the participants. But I guess the critical challenge for me, at least, was that the approaches that I had to hand really tried to understand the indicator as a knowledge artifact, an effort to either know something about the world or to produce some sort of faux representation of authoritative knowledge about the world. But this just really didn't help me that much when it came to the workshop, because I was confronted with people who were trying to deny their own and each other's knowledge about the rule of law in this case. So the emphasis, to go back to a word I've used, was on ignorance. It was people trying to claim that no one really knew what the rule of law was. And so the methods that assume that governance is about making authoritative knowledge claims or even limiting uncertainty aren't great at least they weren't great for me at helping analyze people who profess and embrace ignorance about this thing. So that's why you see some efforts to try and use slightly different methods and styles in the piece that particularly, well, in both pieces, in particular the indicators piece. So working with conversation, working with film. In other work, I'm working with theater, with visual art and so on, just to try and work out how to tell the political dynamics of something like this ignorance without assuming necessarily that it's being deployed strategically. Second, very simple point is the complexities of inhabiting this sort of policy space. Many of us are working in different languages, trying to speak across disciplines. The dynamic that I outlined really also requires people to speak the different languages of academic policy and advocacy tribes and maybe other tribes as well. It's a profoundly multilingual environment. And as a result, it's hugely amenable to gatekeeping. And so I try and suggest a little bit of that in the paper. It's not something that I've pursued as much in my recent work. I've certainly had conversations with Rene about this, and I'd just be really interested to know if this has come up in people's work here, the extent to which the embrace of complexity actually introduces propensities to gatekeeping and process capture, that they can be exclusionary and not just inclusionary. And then the third is the sort of simple point that both of the pieces kind of gesture towards, which is how do we engage with such processes as both ethical and political actors? So particularly given the intensification of the data revolution in aid, both pieces, but in particular the piece on field research, tries to push against the idea that the main obligation we might have as researchers and scholars is an ethical one to people who participate in the research process with us, and to try and push a little bit harder on resituating ourselves as political actors within this process of not just knowledge production, but ignorance production as well. How can we think of our own responsibility as individuals and political actors in a system that produces prototypes, pilots, and very provisional action? And so that's more of an open question that I'm grappling with and have no good answer for, and that I would also be very interested to hear your thoughts on as they crop up in your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deval. So we can start the debate. So we're eager to hear the audience's opinions, comments, or questions. Who wants to break the ice? Thank you, Daniel, for breaking the ice.
Manolo. And thank you, Deval. Very interesting papers and very interesting presentation. So I would like to ask you 3 questions. First one is just to try to understand in a more precise way your research project. I would like to know a little bit more about one key concept that you use in at least one of the papers, the political economy of knowledge. One of the papers you say that what you are describing and analyzing is the political economy of knowledge in the context of rule of law projects and development projects. Right? But of course, this is an open textured concept. And depending on how you think about it, what you're going to analyze and how you're going to analyze it varies. So it would be interesting to hear your take on this key concept. The second question has 2 components. So I thought that the metaphor and approach to understanding the production and exchange of legal knowledge that you named chain of production is really interesting. But I was thinking about some possible limits of the metaphor, because what the metaphor does, what allows you to do in a productive way, is to anonymize the process of production and exchange of legal knowledge. So you can analyze from this perspective, as you do, right, in the short paper, the production and distribution and consumption of tomatoes and the production, consumption, and exchange of legal knowledge, right? And that, I think, it's very interesting. But at the same time, when you think about these issues from a legal perspective in the context of the law, you might need to think about specific actors, specific operators, right? And the identities of these operators in order to understand how these processes work, right? So the fact that the metaphor chain of production anonymizes all this process obscures these identities that are important to understand these processes. At the same time, I thought that there was a tension, perhaps, between this paper about the chain of production that reflects about the chain of production and the long paper, where you invite your reader to combine both the analysis of institutional roles, the academic, and the specific identities of some academics, of certain individuals who are part of this project. But you're not talking about types of individuals in this genre of individuals, not the the global north academic within the category of the academic, right? But you're talking about the Deval Desai that was part of this specific process, right? So it seems that there's if not a contradiction, at least a tension between these 2 parts of your. The third question is about ethical challenges. I wanted to hear about what you have thought about being both an insider and an outsider in this process. And I think you are an insider and an outsider at the same time in two ways. The first one is, well, you are a critical thinker on the one hand, and on the other hand, you are participating in processes that create legal knowledge that are problematic, right, within this domain of critical thinking and critical thinkers. Right? So I wonder how you see, this ethical challenge. The other one, the other dimension of your dual capacity is the fact that you are part of the process of creating legal knowledge, and at the same time, you are taking distance from this process and analyzing it and telling a story about it. But this dual capacity can create problems, right? Since you are working for long periods with people, you might want to say certain things, but not others. You might want to emphasize on certain things and not others, also because you are responsible of these processes, right? And some of these challenges might be conscious and explicit. Some might be just implicit, right? Things that you do and you don't do just because you are part of the process. And you cannot say when you take this, and you can not reflect upon them when you take distance from this process. So when I was reading the long paper, I was thinking about some of the novels that are written about friendship and love and family, right? Where the novelist bases his or her fiction on his or her experiences. No, so the novel is about her friends, her family, right? And of course, this creates a lot of ethical problems, right? Perhaps the family and friends won't be too happy about how they presented, how the novels present themselves, or well, because the novelist is so immersed in these processes that he or she might not tell all the dimensions that are constituting this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, those are several comments and questions, so maybe Deval wants to tackle them.
Sure. God, there's a huge amount of wonderful stuff in there. Let me pick up on a couple of them. I think, so I think there's probably a relationship between the second and the third points that Daniel was articulating. And let me see if I can articulate it in this way and then respond to it. So Daniel quite rightly points out that, oh, and I guess this relates to the first point as well. I have a story that adopts dry sociological categories in a somewhat glib way, the academic, the advocate, the policymaker, and then a highly particularized invocation of certain characters sitting around a table. There is a not accidental relationship or homology between that and the ways in which the process of indicator production moved very quickly between the universal and the particular, avoiding building out the texture in between of what the rule of law might be. So one response to your point, Danielle, about where is the texture in between? Are you really taking seriously, for example, the role of the judge as both somebody who's playing a professional role and a situated individual? Are you taking that seriously enough? So one of the responses is methodological, that this is to reflect precisely the process that I see around the table. But there's also sort of a second response to that, which I think, if I've understood right, is it relates to the methodological challenge that you pose, which is, well, if you want it, are you saying that, and that sounds very nice and very smart, it's a nice juxtaposition, but really, are you unable to tell that story about the sort of texture in between these dry sociological categories and the individuals because you're an insider-outsider, because you're too close to your subjects, and you can either talk in the language of abstract academia or up close and personal? some people might want me to say some things and not others. I can't really faithfully give a full, thickly textured account of who they are. So I think there are sort of two, I've long had two thoughts about that. One is that it is, I found it interesting to think about, and you see that in the shorter piece, that the ways in which people closely relate the ethical and the methodological, in the sense that the word ethical there seems to be doing double work as an expression of a relational ethic to other people and as something to do with the pursuit of truth. And I suspect that, and there are long traditions in novel writing in particular that you point to, where those two are pulled apart, where part of the agon of being the person who writes is to find yourself caught between the relationships that you have with others and the inspiration that you draw from them and your desire to say something true, which is to say that the thick texture that you're talking about of the characters, and that might be missing, and why can't I say that maybe I should be saying something more about them, is in part a reflection of my own weaknesses as a writer. I mean, fundamentally what I'm doing is gesturing towards both a subject position for myself and a mode of writing that is more novelistic, and I'm just not that good at it. In the hands of a better writer, who's adopting the sort of ethical position that I'm trying to adopt, they would be able to give you that sense. But I do then turn back to and rely on the fact that at the very least, I'm trying to point towards some of the structural features of the thing that I'm trying to describe through exemplification. So I am also, partly because of the limits of my own skill and partly as a methodological, a rhetorical device, I guess, not really filling in that intermediate textual space to kind of show the effects of what's going on in the room. So the way in which the people developing these indicators bounce between the universal and the particular actually ends up hollowing out that sort of space that people who are doing the implementation and people who are on the receiving end of governance can inhabit. It arrogates that sort of position, the ability to thickly texture in the future, to people who are around the table, like myself. The other brief thought is on the political role of the university. So something that you were saying about insider and outsider seems to rest quite, perhaps a bit on the idea, on an unarticulated assumption that whatever the university is, it's given the public license to be an institution where people can step back from the world and reflect on, for us, phenomena that we see, social phenomena that we see, and articulate truths about them. So, there is the university as an institutionalized space for outsider thinking. And one part of particularly the project in the shorter piece is to reflect on, so there's it's situated within in an encounter with a lot of British academia, where there is a relentless pursuit of impact on the part of our research. That's one of the things on which our research is graded every 7 years. And that it is increasingly difficult to disentangle or to sustain that idea that the university is anything other than an insider-outsider space as a place of the production of governing knowledge, also as a public institution. So yeah, part of the project for that other piece that you're reflecting on is to try and very simply reiterate and reinforce the idea that the university is itself quite profoundly entangled in the insider-outsider dynamic that you are pointing to.
Thank you, Deval. We have a question from Julio. Let me try to... How can I give you the microphone? I have no idea.
Now I have.
Okay.
Hi, Deval. Thank you very much for being here with us. Sorry about the cam, but as soon as I turned on the computer, it didn't work. But I would like to ask you if these consultations are not really a technical exercise, as the emptiness of justice and security concepts show us. How are these indicators related to the neoliberal ideology as a transnational political project?
It's related to neoliberal ideology as a transnational political project. Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the neoliberal ideology as a transnational political project, or just to make sure that I'm understanding what you're pushing against?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Wakantian concept of neoliberal as a transnational political project, for instance, the reduction of welfare state, and for example, the enshrining of the penal state as the police and the administration of justice and penitentiaries as well. Yeah.
Cool. So a smaller response and a bigger response. The smaller response alludes to something that I mentioned briefly in the short presentation, which is one of the relationships that I'm particularly interested in is the ways in which this sort of process, the empty indicators, the ever ongoing discussions about the rule of law, might be a way of simply diverting political energy, and particularly critical political energy of the sort of project that you're talking about, away from its operations through the guise of engaging meaningfully with counter projects, political counter projects to what you're calling transnational neoliberalism. So Stephen Humphreys has called this governance by inoculation, sort of a version of that. But really creating sites that are loosely coupled, to use in the similar tradition to the one that you're talking about. So Antoine Baucher's thought about weak fields that are loosely coupled with these sorts of transnational political projects, using a similar Bourdieusian sort of language, that are ways of drawing in political energy and people with political energy, helping them imagine that they're part of critiquing that overall political project, because there is some coupling, but the coupling being weak enough that they can never really meaningfully make a dent. So that would be the smaller response. The bigger response would be, is this really all that different to what some people have articulated as their version of the transnational neoliberal project? So their understanding of global or transnational neoliberalism would be somewhat different to the articulation that you gave, and it would be more as a set of methods and techniques of governing that are fundamentally concerned with the social as the problematic for governance, trying to undermine the givenness, the quiddity, the existence of the social, and doing so by continually trying to make it provisional and redefining it through things like pilots and prototypes and essentially highly contingent institutional experiments, the function of which isn't necessarily to control the social, but to make it destabilized. So, I'm interested in that strand of thinking. I know that that's been influential for some of the people that I've mentioned, Fleur Johns in particular. And so I'm interested in the extent to which what I'm seeing marks a continuity with different forms of neoliberalism, including the version that you've mentioned, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Well, any more questions or comments? I will jump in then, so maybe other people, well, I have Rene. Go ahead, Rene. I will be a very educated host, so go ahead, please.
So sorry. Okay, can you hear me? So
hey
Deval,
Rene,
how are you
nice
doing?
to see you.
How are you doing?
Good,
Yeah,
how are
me
you?
too. Hi, I'm okay, thank you. Good to see you. So such an interesting talk, and so, but every time that I hear you talking about this, I always wonder, so whether this, where there's this north-south dimension to this, let's say, a rediscovery of flexibility or of contingency, in the sense that, so while this ability to incorporate critique and then celebrate, let's say, context and flexibility seems to be the new thing, and therefore seems to be restricted to those, let's say, in the centers of global production of knowledge. And obviously Daniel here has written very much about that. But so it seems that then in a very interesting reversal, then those who are outside the centers of production of knowledge then are left with a very positivist sense of description, while this idea of contingency, experimentation remains in the centers, in the institutional centers of knowledge production. So it figures that while it is true that it is experimentation, it remains very much strict in the sense of the production of knowledge. So perhaps Daniel, who has written a lot about these differences between North and South in terms of the political economy of knowledge, could pitch in, because it seems that it's this, this new flexibility is the new thing, but as the new thing that is reserved to those who are already in the old new thing. In a way, I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I don't, Danielle, if you want to come in on that as well. I'm happy to respond, but just if you had anything to add. So I love these questions from Rene, and he's also got some amazing papers on this as well, about this inversion of flexibility and formalism. All I'll say is that empirically, this is really interesting. So it strikes me that on one level, that's an empirical question, and I have some reflections on that at an empirical level. But it also strikes me that it's really interesting that that ought to be an empirical question. Whereas, that sort of history of anti-formal practice in particular, we really ought to take for granted as being highly distributed, since it's something that we've been pathologizing for decades. So just to recognize, but also say that I haven't really finalized my thoughts on why it is that should be an empirical question. I'm a little bit puzzled. Why is it that we'd be discovering, thinking empirically about whether or not groups in the South have the capacity to think flexibly is a really strange one. But empirically, I have found it to be, I'm finding the work on the ways in which social entrepreneurship and legal reform, particularly through legal empowerment projects, have intersected and overlapped to be really, really interesting and quite productive, where it strikes me that it's not necessarily right that formalism gets arrogated to, or gets pushed onto groups in the South. It might be that those formalisms are the domain of groups in the South who have long sought to be accepted with their seat at the table through increasing claims to professionalization of formalism. And now all of a sudden, as they've got the really, really nice reports and they're able to talk these really formalistic languages, the way in which we reproduce our distinction is to move on and speak flexibly. So it might be for those groups that's true, but there is a really interesting intersection between social enterprises or NGOs that are influenced by social entrepreneurship. So Namati would be one of them. There's an intersection between them and the incorporation, both rhetorically and practically, of this sorts of flexible experimentation down at the local level amongst groups that are speaking the language of authenticity, localism, and practicing transformative justice in highly experimental ways. But it's being done through networks of private funding and through a language that emerges from business schools in a way that I find really, really interesting. Again, not quite sure. I haven't got any concluding thoughts, but empirically, I just think that the site has shifted slightly.
Well, I want to jump in and maybe following up Rene's and Daniel's comments, maybe because we all come from the global South. But I was thinking it's very interesting, the idea of fluidity, which I think is central to your paper, and the disruption of identity, time and place, and you show it with your experience in Vienna. But I was thinking at the same time, okay, this idea of fluidity is very appealing, but at the same time, I think that there are some fixing identities that contain that fluidity. So for instance, you don't mention it explicitly in your paper, but I was wondering, and I haven't been a conspiracy theorist, but who was going to that meeting in Vienna? There was like an equal representation from the global south and north. My suspicion is that was mostly from people, scholars, advocates, or policymakers from the global north. So that's a fixed identity that excludes other possibilities of identities. And also I was thinking, when you were saying, well, these ideas of the rule of law, security, justice are so vague, so broad, so empty that you can fill them in with any kinds of contents. But anyway, and you said that in the discussions, like you could see how policymakers became scholars, scholars became policymakers, etc. But at the same time, my suspicion is that if you're a scholar, maybe you have a broad idea or frame of reference about the concepts such as justice, security, which may be kind of different from broad ideas and frameworks of justice and security of a policymaker or an advocate. So I believe there are still some fixing identities or structural differences that to say in a way like contain this fluidity. What do you think about that, or you think that that's exactly what you are opposing, like an old-fashioned idea of structures?
So I guess a couple of, let me give the big thought and then the smaller thoughts. I think that might make more sense. The big thought is not to oppose it, but really to point out the ways in which those critical, or those moves to point to structure very rapidly get internalized into the rhetorical process. It was totally, and this was something that was mentioned, I can't remember if it was in this workshop, but certainly another UN workshop that I was part of, the SDG development, participation and representation across the global north and south was used as a way of making whatever came out of that workshop provisional, not illegitimate. So it wasn't, and that was interesting, it wasn't used as a delegitimating move completely, but it was to say, look, what we come up with can't ever be adequate because there has to be better participation. You know, we have to hear these other voices. So they're quite rapidly internalized. And that's the dynamic that I'm most interested in sort of thinking through and working with, which is the ways in which the emptiness facilitates an internalization of critique that in turn might have a set of political effects that aren't, so it's not just, hey, look, our critique has been successful, but that those critiques are then being used in the furtherance of particular governance projects. The slightly more specific thought, and this is quite a boring one actually, I guess, is that while I can't remember the Vienna breakdown, I know that for the other UN ones that I participated in, they were all either significantly or overwhelmingly Global South represented. And there was also a strong effort to perform at least non-eliteness in the sense of incorporating authentic locals. So in one of them, there was a presentation by a paramount chief from a specific rural area in a specific Southeast African country. It gave a sort of a long speech about how the rule of law and justice were really fundamental, but that what we had to do was really listen to the voice of the people and the community people like his people. And it turned out that, you know, what he and his people meant by the rule of law and justice looked quite similar to the list that an NGO representative from his sort of part of the world, very specific part of the world, also had to say, and they sort of reinforced each other with invocations of the authentic local. So there was also an effort to point towards non-cosmopolitanism and rootedness as things that should be factored into the notion that we don't really know what the rule of law is. So all of these things were used to point to the essential contestedness of the thing that we were trying to debate. Was there enough global south participation? Even if there was, were these just urban elites or transnational elites? These were all sort of filtered in as ways of pointing to the background structural conditions that meant we couldn't really be an authoritative proclamation of what the rule of law was.
Thank you, Deval. Daniel wants to add something.
Thank you. Yes, Manuel, just to follow up. Two things. The first one, Deval, is related to your point about the political role of the university. And I agree with you. I think that the university is a radically politicized space, and I think that it should be. The thing is that as academics, and more precisely as critical academics, perhaps also we have to choose very carefully where to exercise our political abilities, right? And then we might say, well, if you were a critical thinker, why would you go to these spaces like the workshops that the workshop that you described in Vienna, right? Is it because you, as a critical thinker, want to go to kind of the devil's home to try to destabilize, or because you want to know how the house of the devil is constructed so that you can then go out and describe it, right? And there, I think there are some ethical challenges that I think cannot be answered by what you said before.
Yeah.
More, if you take into account one of the points that I thought was more interesting of the longer paper, that is related to the fact that operators in these meetings were not truly defining anything, right? These categories were so open-ended that you could say anything about justice or security. What was truly at stake, you say, is how these operators were going to deal with other opportunities where they were funding, to do more research and to produce more legal products that might help you with your career and with money and things like that. So there is a very clear, at least possible conflict of interest that adds to this tension between being an outsider and as a critical thinker and an insider participating in these processes. That on the one hand. On the other hand, I would like to put you a little bit about its tension between the chain of production metaphor and the dialogue between the universal and the particular with regard to specific operators or categories of operators. Because again, at least from my interpretation, what is most useful about the chain of production metaphor is that these are anonymous processes, right? You don't need to think about the specific individual that in China produces X or Y. You just say that there are producers, there are distributors, and there are consumers, and that's it. And you can say a lot about that. It has a lot of analytical and critical traction. But if you combine that with saying, well, no, but we do need to talk about specific individuals, not about the identities of categories of individuals, but of specific individuals like Deval, Desai in the meeting of Vienna, then I think you have a serious tension.
Right. So those are very, very helpful. And I think, so how do I organize these reflections? I think some significant part of this comes down to, so what were these projects at that moment in time? Because I think in a lot of ways, I agree with you, and you're certainly pushing in a much more, pushing a lot deeper than I was, and I think I am. And I think it's in these ways. So I think the characters that I was most concerned with at that point in time I think in both of the pieces, were actors who were concerned with their participation in processes of the production of global knowledge. And these are all specifically in the context of the production of knowledge that fits into global governance processes. There were a series of mechanisms whereby they were able to limit, constrain, disconnect their immediate production of knowledge, their production of the tomato, from its relationship to that global governance machinery, and then B, to go back to your point about the political economy of knowledge production, in a very, very thin sense, the rents that they could gain from that, using rents in a non-sophisticated way at all. And I think, so the push was to try and gesture towards the position of these individuals who saw themselves as individuals in larger political processes of knowledge production. But the tools that we ordinarily have to do that, for example, unveiling the background structures, as Manuel was pointing to, rapidly become part of their game of participation. So they're participating as individual, Deval with these kind of credentials, or the chief with his credentials. And so, yeah, the critical arguments that we have to link their individual participation to global processes get rapidly internalized into their efforts to continue to participate, but also to erase any links that their particular position or their particular activities in producing knowledge, like participating around the table in Vienna, have to some eventual process of global governance. So, if I'm saying we don't really know what the rule of law is, it's very hard to draw the links between my specific activity around the table and what happens subsequently in terms of global governance. So the projects at the time were saying, wait, hang on. We might need some set of tools, some set of methods, some modes of thinking that help us repoliticize or re-engage the process of producing not just knowledge, but ignorance, the process of hollowing out what justice and security might mean and not just filling it in with these global processes. So what does that mean for people who are sitting within a university and being a critical thinker, like you're saying? So one of the pushes that results in, and again, this is for people who are producing knowledge that fit into the development world, is to say your ethical responsibility is not only an ethical responsibility either to your practice of truth-telling or to the people who you're enrolling in that practice of truth-telling. Your responsibility might be better understood as political in the sense that you are participating in some sort of relationship between your individual knowledge production and the process of global governance, even though what you think you're doing is either separate from that or critiquing that's still part of how the machine keeps turning. That has, in a concrete way, to do with the pursuit of impact, but also more generally has to do with this broader phenomenon that you have to pay attention to, which is the intensification of data gathering for the purposes of pursuing development. So part of the problematization was to ask precisely the question, to raise precisely the question that you're asking of me, and it's absolutely a right one, and say, well, this is way more pervasive than we think it is. That we really do need to think quite politically about our participation in these things. So part of this paper, and I begin with a sort of, well, I was just sort of happily bumbling into this meeting in Vienna, and it turns out it was way more complicated than that. Now, there are different ways of telling that story with greater or lesser degrees of consciousness, but the device there is very much about trying to capture and spread, put forth, what's the right word? Promote that shift in consciousness that is precisely what you're talking about. And that has one of two results. It either must result in a deeper understanding of exactly what you're working on, that political economy of knowledge production within the broader framework of development knowledge, or a retreat from it in some ways. My work recently has certainly been marked by the latter. But some of the work of the piece on indicators in particular is to try and situate the people who do the critical thought within at least some broader sense of the fact that that critical thought is very much part of knowledge production, and knowledge production not just in terms of, as many other people have written for 2 decades, feeding into the development process, but also in a way that allows them to accrue rents whether or not they acknowledge it, recognize it, engage with it. And I think this comes back, this then relates to your point about the flattening out within the metaphor of the supply chain. So the effort to do so is something, is in effect something similar, which is to place an emphasis not on the academic as an individual with a set of ethical responsibilities towards their research and their research subjects, but as a node within, and you know, it's deliberately flattening. I mean, we make the point that this is quite a reductive metaphor for all sorts of reasons, but also to try and foreground the political responsibility that comes with being a node within the system. And one can think about exactly how one situates oneself in it, but within it. And then to think through a little bit alternative models that might be available. So we gesture towards a couple of them at the end of that piece, to also rethink oneself as both an ethical and political actor within the context of that broader system of knowledge production that's feeding a development machine, whether or not you think you're producing critical work. So should those intermediate positions be filled in? Yes, absolutely. Is that, as you frame it, a much better way of describing in a much more concise fashion a lot of what these pieces talk around? I think you might well be right, that some of the ethico-political work that we're talking about is doing exactly what you're suggesting, which is, well, you know, it is actually a little bit problematic. We're trying to make people feel that it is a little bit problematic to be doing exactly that sort of knowledge work without having an honest reckoning with their position within the contemporary development apparatus, with its massive emphasis on a deeply intensified datafication, an increased data revolution. Such that it's hoovering up the work that we produce. At that point in time, that was beginning, but it was also prefigured by the emphasis on impact for universities. And now I think much more broadly within a data revolution. All of which is to say, you're absolutely right, and in a much more concise way than I've been. But I think you're very helpful in pointing towards some of the subject positioning that we're trying to problematize in those, particularly in the indicators piece and somewhat in the supply chain piece.
Thank you, Deval. We have a question or comment from Olga. Let me see if we can. Okay.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. If I follow your argument, the emptiness or the indeterminacy of this big concept like rule of law or justice and security are inherent. It's a feature that is inherent in the process of production of knowledge in the global governance. So I really would like to know, what is the role of the bureaucrats of the development agencies in this inherent feature, or this emptiness or this indeterminacy? Maybe they could be another subject or identity in this big or whole picture about this production of this process of production of knowledge in global governance.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the first part of that would be to probably draw some limits on the claim, which is, it strikes me as a feature of specific domains. Now, so in this case, security and justice, or the rule of law and security. Is that because of a feature intrinsic to those domains, to that word, rule of law? Is that actually an effect of work that a group of elites do in order to make the thing indeterminate? And it could be the rule of law, but it could be forests, or it could be anything. That's a question that I've sort of been working on and thinking through in a few different guises. I haven't really got an answer to it, but just to limit the claim specifically right now to the rule of law and security without any claims over the validity of what I'm about to say to other domains. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. So our category of policymaker in that piece is not particularly well drawn, but would certainly incorporate bureaucrats within development agencies. Now, the claim is not over every bureaucrat. The claim doesn't, I'm not making that claim to external validity that every bureaucrat either has that sort of consciousness or more precisely does that sort of practice, or every policymaker does that sort of practice. But that it is a feature of the work of enough of them that discussions like the one around the table in Vienna can continue to be returned to, well, this thing called the rule of law doesn't mean very much anyway. That there are at least some group of them who are specialists in indeterminacy. Now, that then leads to the sociological question that Rene asks, which is, well, how is that distributed? Who does get to be that? Who doesn't? How do they participate in these global governance processes? And then that leads to the political economy question that Daniel's asking. But I think you might also be pointing us to the fact that that category of policymaker is not a particularly fine-grained one, and that could certainly be disaggregated both in terms of who gets to do that ignorance work, that unmaking work, but also are they limited in the ways in which they can do it, or does it take on particular forms or practices as a result of their institutional setting? Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Manuel, we
I
can't
forgot to open the microphone. I always forget about that. No, I will let Daniel say his thing, but I will jump in again. Maybe this is a marginal question, but I think it's something very interesting about your papers, and I'm sure Daniel is interested also in this aspect. And you also mentioned about your work is you talk about the third man. So I think this metaphor of applying like this classic film to make your point, it's a very interesting way of communicating, showing us your ideas. And you also mentioned things like art, theater, films are very important to express these kind of ideas and to construct these kinds of identities. So because Daniel is also very interested in the relationship between art and law as forms of culture, and also I'm very interested about films and law. So what do you think about this take of using this kind of cultural artifacts to express this perspective from a methodological and theoretical aspect? And then Daniel can make his question or his comments.
Well, I mean, Daniel, do you want to come in as well, or I can
Yes.
respond to this one first and then?
No, please go ahead if you want to answer Manuel's question.
Sure. I mean, honestly, the sense that I have from reading some of Daniel's stuff and then from this conversation is that Daniel has a huge amount to say on the stuff that I'm thinking about in much more concise and effective ways. I wouldn't be surprised if you're also a novelist and can write these things wonderfully well as well. No, I mean, so I think it's right. For me, it is the only real way that I've been able to find to try and express exactly that problematization that Danielle was pointing to, which is how to try and reimagine yourself as a very thickly understood and textured individual within a constantly shifting set of highly opaque structures that you struggle to understand, struggle to grapple with, get overwhelmed by, and still have ineluctable effects on your ability to articulate yourself as an individual. I mean, that seems to be kind of at the heart of, I'm sure, talking around Danielle's much more concise point. You know, what does it mean to have critical thought when you're destabilizing your subject position and the universals that you're engaging with, and that those, particularly the universals you're engaging with, the big global structures, are constantly moving targets that deny their own existence as universals. And framed in that way, aesthetic devices are the most effective way that I've been able to find to try and express that problem. That constant grappling with an ever-shifting vision of the universal that you can only partially see and may well be an invention of your own mind, but in that encounter, remaking yourself as well, and then trying to think about that as both an ethical and a political position. It strikes me as very reminiscent of the ways in which certain authors have talked about writing, the ways in which Beckett certainly writes his plays. So I've drawn most of my inspiration from theatre, made partly because I'm a failed actor, well, large part because I'm a failed actor, but also because the experiences that it was kind of an orientation towards practice in my work on global governance. And so embodied practice and the ways in which theatre expresses that dynamic of being situated within and against a world that you don't understand are, they go quite well together. But yeah, so, aesthetic devices have been really important in trying to express that sort of central problem in this strand of my work. So, in the book, I've sort of got sections that are written as badly drafted dramatic scripts, and I work with some sort of visual art and other devices and so on.
Thank you, Deval. Daniel?
Thank you. But before asking my question, I wonder if others have questions or comments, because I have already talked a lot. No?
So go ahead, Daniel, and so you can set an example.
Well, I have a question about the political economy of legal knowledge. And perhaps it's a question about the relationship between structure and superstructure. To put it in Marxist terms. So on the one hand, we have the process through which knowledge is produced, exchanged, legitimated. On the other hand, we have the discourses about these processes, right? That are, we can say, right, are part of the superstructure. They're not part of the structure. Final only processes, right? And perhaps in between, you find the generally implicit rules and principles that guide these processes. Right? Where is original knowledge produced? How do you exchange knowledge? What do you have to pay for good knowledge, etc.
Right.
And the discourses about these implicit rules perhaps are up there in the superstructure. But I wonder even if this dichotomy is useful to think about this, right? I don't know what is your take on how to approach this duality of the political economy of legal knowledge.
That's such a good question. So it's a question that I'm really ambivalent on. It's a fundamental question with respect to this work. And it comes back to, really fundamental old questions about critique. So is it turtles all the way down is one question. So in some work that I've just done with Andrew Lang here, we're interested in, he sees similar processes at play in the trade law regime. And one of the very interesting, rather complicated aspects of what we see is that to put it in a very general way, the mode of governance that we're talking about constantly problematizes and folds into its discourse the conditions of possibility of the knowledge that then gives rise to that mode of governance. So to put it a little bit more concretely, let's just talk about the research supply chain, this link between producing authentic research on the ground all the way up to processes of global governance. So it turns out that the British and the Dutch development agencies have funded a series of research looking at the role of research assistants, in inverted commas, as brokers and translators of knowledge and knowledge production, and then the politics of that, the ethics of that, the relationship of that to the Sustainable Development Goals, and more broadly processes of global governance. So sort of the interesting dynamic that is hard to get beyond is the ways in which those efforts to try and distinguish the conditions of possibility of knowledge production from the practices of knowledge production get folded into the practices of knowledge production with some rapidity, partly in order to try and paint a broader or more methodologically complete picture of the data that we're getting as part of our demand for sensation, for data from the world in order to guide whatever contingent action comes next. So I think you're right to sort of make that division, whether it's articulated in Marxian terms or different sort of sociological strands, but it's just really striking to me how those insights and also the different languages of articulating them get folded right back in to those processes of knowledge production. I think the research assistance one is a really fascinating example. I think there was a small quantitative study. I think there have been 60 pieces on that in the last 8 years. Yeah.
Thank you, Deval. Well, we're running out of time. We could have a little bit more time for a further question or comment, but maybe the students are still a bit shy. Maybe it's the language, who knows? So last opportunity. Like in the British pubs, we're going to ring the bell for last drinks. Last drinks, last chance. Well, maybe that's it. Deval, thank you very much for joining us. For me, it was a pleasure listening to you and exchanging ideas with you. And hopefully we'll have you back at Los Andes in flesh and blood in the near future. So you have an open invitation.
That sounds wonderful. And I would love to see any and all of you here in Edinburgh as well. And I suspect I might well actually be, which I'm really looking forward to.
That would be great.
And well, if any of the students are interested in talking about their projects, I'd love to. I mean, I can be around for another half hour or so. If anyone would want to talk about their projects, I'm very excited.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you, Deval. So if people have to go, we can wait a little bit. And if some of the students want to have a chat with Deval, here you have a great chance to do it. Thank you very much.
Please do tell Deval about your research projects. Hear what Deval has to say about approaches. Please take advantage of this great opportunity. And as Manuel said, Deval, it was really a pleasure to have you here. It was a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been, the feeling is reciprocated and doubled. It's just been a lot of fun. Thank you.